I think we are pretty much here. There were usually stragglers coming in from time to time, but we might as well get started. I issued an invitation over the website, the announcement function somehow, to invite everybody to just get in touch with me, give Ollie and I a couple of paragraphs telling us a little bit about yourself, why you're here, what you're looking for. And a number of you have done that, and so we're very grateful for that. If any of you have something to give us tonight, you can just give it to us before you leave. And it's never too late. This isn't an assignment, so it's just an invitation to hear from you so that we have more of a sense of who it is we're meeting with on Monday nights and with our undergraduate students on Wednesday nights as well. Okay, so we had a good session last Wednesday night of a number of undergraduate students, and so we were able to kind of delve into things a little bit more deeply. That was really great. So tonight, maybe before I proceed, are there any questions that anyone has about the course or details of any sort? Everything's clear? Oh, Mary Margaret?
Yes, could you send out the invitation again? I was going to write it out, and I've lost it in my emails.
Sure, yeah. It's pretty much just what I said.
I didn't know how to email it to both of you, I guess.
Oh, I forwarded it to both of these guys, to Simon and to Oliver, if you send it to me. Yeah, so that's no problem. The other thing is, if you go to the website, you will find the YouTube video from last week up there already, thanks to Nancy, both Nancys, for making that available. And we have also Oliver's slides up there from last week as well. And we'll be putting up tonight's slides, both of ours, as well as the video between now and next week. So you can always go back and look at that stuff, okay? All right. So tonight, we both want to talk about what basically are the conditions for the possibility of talking about religion and science at all. In general, this is what is called by the fancy word metaphysics. And I'll be delving into that a little bit more deeply in the next few minutes. So I'm going to be lecturing or presenting, and of course, if you have questions, shoot your hands up if you'd like, for the next half hour or so, maybe 35 minutes. And then we'll take a break so that we can switch microphones and all that kind of good stuff. And Oliver will take over the second half. So I'm going to be dealing primarily with the religious theological side of things. The accent will be there, and Oliver's accent will be on the conditions for the possibility of doing science, okay? And then after he holds forth, we'll have another 20 minutes or so to have the kind of conversation that we had last week, all right? So if you have follow-up questions and that kind of thing, we can engage in conversation. All right, I'd like to begin with just simply a question. This is a rhetorical question. I'm not asking you to answer it right now, but how did we get into this place where we talk about religion and science as a problem? How did we arrive at a place culturally where religion is sometimes thought to be in opposition to science and vice versa? This dualism that we more or less take for granted. And of course, we'll talk next week about various ways of dealing with that, whether it's dialogue or other forms of cooperation. But right now, we're just asking that question. How did we get here in the first place? Now, I'm going to be therefore looking at some of the origins of this, what I'm calling this dualism this week, in the next few minutes. I have a clip. It's about 5 minutes. I'm not sure if it's going to work, though, because we don't have a sound system. So we'll give it a try. If it doesn't work, I'll tell you what's going on, okay? But if you go to YouTube, you will find, just put in Richard Dawkins and George Coyne, you'll find this wonderful hour-long conversation. between the two. Everybody knows who Richard Dawkins is, I presume, one of the so-called new atheists, very articulate spokesman for his position. And George Coyne is the recently retired director of the Vatican Observatory. He's a Jesuit, and he's a physicist himself, does astronomy. Dawkins interviewed him on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. And it so happened that it coincided with another anniversary involving Galileo. I can't remember which one it was. I mean, Coyne is really not an expert on evolution, but he can talk about the relationship between science and religion. In fact, we wanted to get him here, but I think he's kind of beyond that point where he wants to do this kind of thing much longer. He's kind of into his more advanced research and reading and just enjoying life, I think. But at any rate, this is kind of the most religious part of the interview, I think, where George talks about his own theology of God vis-a-vis the wider picture of creation. So let's see if we can hear this, see what happens. Oh, yes, well, that's what happened. I don't think you need to know it anyway. How did that happen? That's funny. I guess I'm not connected. Well, refresh it.
The Wi-Fi symbol up top.
Oh, yes, yeah. I'm not a visitor. There I am. Okay, it should come through now. There we are. I need to refresh the page. Okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't refresh.
Would you say that although God didn't design living things, that maybe he designed the laws of physics in the first place, or something like that?
I would say, first of all, in very general terms, from my religious faith and my scientific knowledge, God works through evolution. God not only is the source of all being, that is, I don't know if we want to get into a discussion of what it means that God created the universe, but I believe that God created the universe, okay? But that was not a moment, just a moment in time. God is continuously creating the universe, and he's working with the universe as we know the universe scientifically. If I'm faithful to what I know as a scientist, I reflect back upon the God I believe in, and I say, this God is marvelous. He created a universe that shares in his own dynamism and creativity through the evolutionary process. That is, he's not dominating the universe. He's not an autocrat. He's not a watchmaker. He's none of this. He's the God who created a universe he loves and gave to that universe a creativity and a dynamism of its own.
If it's sort of running itself, and evolution is running itself, doesn't that leave God with rather little to do? Might you not be, as it were, disappearing altogether if you don't let him interfere in the way that you don't?
Oh, I won't let him interfere. I don't think God would want to interfere, even if we invited him to. But God sustains everything that's happening in existence. And now this is philosophy. This is not science. But from philosophical considerations, a reasoning human being, some of us reason one way, some of another, would say that everything I know in the universe is contingent. That is, it doesn't have to exist. In fact, I know it exists for a while and then it goes out of existence. And I reason like Aristotle did and St. Thomas Aquinas. If there's something that moves, someone had to move it. Well, if someone moved it, someone had to move them to move it. And I can go all the way back. Well, it would be irrational to say there's not a prime mover. I mean, there has to be someone who started this process. So with existence and with motion and everything else, philosophically considering it, there has to be a necessary being. Now, mind you, I'm reasoning to what I call the God of the philosophers. Now, that happens to be, I think, the God of faith also. But it's not adequate. The God of the philosophers is not adequate to me, because it's not a God who loves, it's a God who explains certain things that I notice about creation. It's contingency and all.
Prime mover is a thing. It's almost like just the first domino to fall and then everything else. That doesn't sound like a very godlike attribute.
That's what I just said. That's why it's not the God.
It's not satisfying.
God is not satisfying at all. It's the God who revealed himself, as we were saying before in Scripture. The God who got angry, the God who loved, the God who said to the people of ancient Israel, you know, you turn against me, you rebel against me, and yet I love you and I will continue to love you through all the ages, through Abraham and the prophets and all. That's the God of religious faith.
There are people in their own field of cosmology who will say something like the fundamental constants of the universe of physics.
Okay, that's kind of where we're going to stop. That's where we're going to stop. This could go on and on. And it does go on and on, as a matter of fact, for well over an hour. But the reason I took that little clip there was, first of all, because I think it's just the whole event of George Coyne and Richard Dawkins sitting down and talking to one another is kind of fascinating. But also because he makes a distinction there between the God of the philosophers and the God of faith. And that's a very important distinction, I think. And it's one that we find also, as we will see, in the Western tradition, going back to the Greeks and all the way up to Thomas Aquinas. And then finally, that all gets officially separated out in modernity when, as a matter of fact, the whole philosophical question of God pretty much falls out of the picture. That distinction is something that we are going to be working with here in the next few minutes. So let me go back to where I was. All right. So Richard Dawkins and George Coyne. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about this notion of religion. And I want to talk about religion in the moment in a pre-modern sense, a more of a primitive sense of religion. This picture, by the way, is actually not that ancient. It's only about 16th century. It comes from the Mughal period in India, which was very heavily influenced by Western art. As a result, in large part of the work of the Jesuits there, which we'll be saying a little bit more about. This whole thing of religion and science is tricky because we don't want to read back into history and look for the same kind of dualism in history, in previous years of periods of history, that we take for granted today. In pre-modern periods, and here we're talking certainly from the Middle Ages backwards, religion is not an identity so much as a pietas, a piety. Piety does not mean pious actions and various sorts of devotional forms of religion. Piety is a whole disposition toward reality. Pietas is standing ready to receive some kind of communication from the numinous. And so religion, even though there were certainly forms of religion, we have ancient Israel, George Coyne just referred to that, religions were not established according to the lines of modern denominations and modern divisions of religious taxonomies the way we are accustomed to thinking of it today. The word itself, as many of you know, comes from the idea of binding together, and also if it comes from religare, and scholars are not sure if it does or not, would also suggest imposing certain kinds of impositions upon people, binding people together, binding all dimensions of life together. So it's not just the worship part, what today we think of as church or synagogue or prayer or spirituality, but it is the whole of life that is bound together in this sense of the numinous. Now, within that broad general understanding of religion, we can, of course, specify various kinds of forms of religion, which actually, I mean, again, from a modern point of view, are more tribal than theological. So, for example, back to ancient Israel, you have the difference between the temple Jews of Jerusalem and the Samaritans of the northern kingdom. They're both Semitic peoples. They both trace their roots back to Abraham. They have different customs. They have different histories. Their histories parted at one point. Different imaginaries, different boundaries. So there are going to be among these peoples differences in what they believe. We could speak of this as creed. There are going to be different ethical teachings. We can think of that as code. And there are going to be different ways of actually expressing these religions in some mode of worship or of prayer. This is what we would think of as cultus. So yes, there was certainly a sense of the tribal other in the pre-modern world, but we're not talking about fully developed denominations or specifically of religious others, but it is more of a tribal other. The other thing that pre-modern religion provides is a whole framework for interpreting reality, a paradigm. We get this word actually from a philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, K-U-H-N, who wrote a famous book that many of you probably have read or soon will, called The Structures of Scientific Revolutions. And in it, he gives these pictures of what he calls paradigms, which are overarching frameworks for interpretation and understanding of all of reality. And we'll be looking at one of those major paradigms in just a few moments, the Aristotelian paradigm, which reigned within the West pretty much up through the 16th century, at which time it really fell apart. So in a very broad sense, we can speak of religion in this way. This has nothing to do with the more fully developed forms of religion that we may be familiar with today. Okay? Okay. Now a word about faith. This is another word that gets bandied about. Sometimes we talk about faith in science. Faith. Faith is a very Western term, I think. It depends on, at least in the Western tradition, faith depends on certain evidences that are given in what is called revelation. Now, revelation sounds supernaturalistic, but what it is referring to is the sheer givenness of what people refer to as the numinous or the transcendent, the mystery of existence, if you will. And this sense of revelation, the sheer givenness of the transcendent, is a characteristic of all Western religions, certainly the Abrahamic religions, that is, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You find it, for example, you find it symbolized in the Hebrew scriptures. So, for example, when Moses goes up the mountain and encounters the burning bush in that theophany, right, that manifestation of God, that's something that's surely given to him. Now, of course, we're not taking that literally. That's a symbolic representation of the givenness of this evidence, if you will, as are all the other things that we find there. Again, we're limiting this to the West here. Faith in these traditions is, it's an act of our minds, of our intellects, to be sure, in a certain sense saying yes to what has been given, but it's also an act of will, of volition, of desire. This is where, with something that moves us into the passions, into the realm of experience, because something is impinging upon us and we are returning, in a certain sense, a reaction to it. In the Western tradition, again, and we get this from Thomas Aquinas, and we'll be looking at this a little bit later, Thomas, that is, we make a distinction between fides qua and fides quae. Fides qua is basically the way people talk about what they believe, what they have faith in. So some people would say, I have faith in a one God, right? Fides qua is how you get there. It's how you come to a knowledge that's sure enough that you can say that. And it's also how you live it. It's how you practice it. It's how you appropriate it and make it part of your own life. Faith needs to be distinguished from belief, although they're very closely related to each other. You can be a person of some kind of religious faith, but have a lot of questions about what you believe. You can say that you believe X, Y, or Z, because you may repeat a creed, let's say if you go to church, or the Shema if you go to temple, okay, whatever. But the actual explicit understanding of whatever you're saying is something that you don't necessarily have. So there sometimes is a slippage between faith and believing. Now, believing is a huge topic in and of itself, but again, and this takes us back to what George Coyne was saying, we can believe that there is a God, credere deum, in the philosophic sense. That's what's going on in Thomas Aquinas and his 5 proofs or demonstrations for the existence of a God. That's for the existence of a philosophic model of God, an uncaused cause, okay? But to believe in God is closer to what we think of when we think of believing. It's an act of entrustment, a giving of oneself over to in the bindings of love. We get that in the Summa Theologiae, the second part of the second part. This means question 1, article 1. That's how you abbreviate the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas. This faith and the beliefs that go with it, as we know, are normally lived within traditions and with institutional arrangements, ecclesiae, gatherings of people, whether they be churches or synagogues or mosques or whatever they might happen to be. Okay? But this is a very Western idea, faith. Now we have lifted it up out of its original context, and we talk about all kinds of faiths, world faiths. We talk about Buddhism as a faith. We talk about Hinduism as a faith, and so on and so forth. Zoroastrianism, whatever. And that's fine. We can do that. But I think it's also important to understand that there is an original Abrahamic specificity to this word as well. And that when we use it properly, there are certain kinds of limits to perhaps how we can use it. By the way, that's, of course, Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, everybody's favorite chapel, right? Okay, now a couple of other terms that are going to be important. One is theology. I'm not going to go into the whole history of theology here. But I do want to say this about theology, that theology is something that is presupposing faith, okay? Faith, the stuff of faith is its subject matter. Does this mean a person who does not have or subscribe to, let's say, Christian faith cannot do theology? No, not necessarily. You could do a kind of philosophical theology. But mostly it is undertaken by people within the context of a particular faith. And it is a scientia, a way of knowing. That's all science is, a way of knowing about what this faith is. Okay? It is inherently hermeneutical or interpretive, and this is where Paul Ricoeur and others come into play. If you look at any of the major documents of these religions, they're already interpreting faith. The Gospels are interpretations of Jesus. They're viewed through a number of different lenses, different histories, different communities, different agendae. These are blatant interpretations of Jesus in light of generations of stories about him, and so on and so forth. The same could be said of the Talmud and the Hadith as commentaries upon the scriptures. So there's this interpretation, this constantly coming to new understandings of what it's all about is native to what we mean by theology. Theology is not just a Christian or Jewish or Islamic activity. Its origins, even of the very word, are found in the Greek philosophers who, of course, antedate all of that. Plato talks about it as a way of speaking of the gods, and he thinks that the most appropriate way of speaking about the gods is through poetry and myth and legend, stories, and so forth, as you might expect from Plato, because he liked to engage in dialogue and narrative. Aristotle, on the other hand, in his Metaphysics, which, by the way, as some of you probably know, is named because it's the book next to the physics. That's when it was found in the library originally. Anyway, he says that, again, going back to this idea of a philosophical principle of God, he says the theos, the God, is the first principle toward which our reasoning is going to ultimately lead us, this unmoved mover, this uncaused cause. Again, this is a philosophical statement. This is not a religious statement. It's not a theological statement, okay? But if you ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing, which is not exactly Aristotle's question, but it was that question of the pre-Socratics, nevertheless, his answer would be this first ontological principle, ho theos, beyond which there is no other principle. That's where everything begins, the arche. Yeah.
When you talk about why there is something rather than nothing, if there were nothing, we would not be here to
Right.
observe nothing.
Right.
So it's kind of a stupid question.
Well, it is in a way, yeah, except that it's a kind of question that you hear in a freshman dorm all the time. And it starts with awe, right? The fact that one exists. It starts with these are the questions that start with oneself. You know, how is it that I am here? How is it that anything is here?
It shouldn't be a question, it should be an appreciation.
Well, okay, well, pardon?
I have that question.
Okay, you do. And other people have that question, or have had that question, perhaps? Yeah. It could be a stupid question, perhaps. But Aristotle, I think, doesn't think that it is. He, in fact, starts his metaphysics by saying that all human beings, by nature, desire to know, and that this is something that arises out of a certain sense of wonder and awe over the sheer fact of existence. So what he wants to do then is to provide the conditions for the possibility of talking about anything that exists at all. Yes. So, but it is possible that in the broader sense, within the paradigms that we are inhabiting today, such a question might seem kind of superfluous. What I did want to say, though, is that by the time theology becomes a discipline within the Christian West, it becomes a university discipline. This is going to dovetail into something else I'm going to follow up with. And in the medieval university, if you go to University of Paris or Padua, Oxford, Cambridge, theology and this science of God is what one scholar has called the architectonic of the university. So you start out with the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. You work up to the quadrivium, which is math, geometry, optics, and astronomy, or music. That's 5. Oh, well. And so it's the math and geometry, I guess, are 1. And then you start specializing, and the typical specializations in those days were law and medicine. Surprise! And but the kind of the synthesizing discipline for all of this was theology, which is kind of inconceivable to us today. I mean, given the modern university.
Is trivium somehow the root of our contemporary word trivial?
It is. It is. I suspect that the scientists of those days thought it was trivial stuff.
What do we think today?
Pardon?
And what do we think today?
Today, I would say if you're teaching, you think that's pretty essential stuff. Because as I tell my students, unless you can express yourself very clearly in writing, at least, and I like it in speech as well. I'm not assured of the fact that you are thinking clearly either. So it's very, very important. And that's what these arts were about, the liberal arts. They were the liberal arts because they freed you. This is John of Salisbury. They freed you to be able to function and to operate in some of these other realms. You know. Science, it was in these days, again, we're talking about the Middle Ages, an ecclesiastical discipline. In a way that's kind of hard for us to imagine today, the church was the de facto custodian of culture in Europe. And it's sort of like was the giant Ford Foundation or something. Some of this, of course, was self-declared. There was a certain sense of self-importance on the part of some of the popes, but there was a synthetic function that was exercised by the various organs of the church, including drawing into the thinking of the Christian West Islamic and Jewish sources as well. A lot of this happened in the monasteries. After the kind of the nadir of Western civilization around 600 or so, you begin to get the development of monasteries, and these monasteries became places where Greek culture was rediscovered. Where there were practical, everyday sciences like botany and animal husbandry that were taking place. Things were being written down, they were being illustrated. And so you have the foundations that are being laid for the universities, which are going to be established shortly thereafter. And these are also places where various kinds of experimentation was going on, but it was all under the rubric of natural philosophy. We're not yet into modern science. Huh? This is all thought of as a branch of philosophy. So everything that you were studying in the medieval Western Christian university was pointing you ultimately toward God, right? That's
Could we go back to, was it Archimedes that measured the diameter of the Earth by seeing where the sun shone down?
That's right, and some of that is what is being recovered here because it had been forgotten. There was a whole period there from roughly the 2nd through the 6th centuries where that was forgotten. In fact, you see this here? This is a representation of God as a geometer. So there's this blending of cultures that is taking place at this time. Up here you have clerics who are conducting some kind of experiments with geometry. So Archimedes is very important, you're right. Up here on the upper right, you have a Christian scholar and a Muslim scholar working together on a problem of geometry. What happens is, as time moves on, however, and into the early modern period, as we move more and more through the Middle Ages, and that some of this activity comes under the patronage of local potentates, princes, duchies, and so on and so forth. And you have the beginning of learned societies. One of the most famous was the Society of the Lynx-eyed, to which belonged many late medieval, early modern scientists, including Galileo. And this was the progenitor to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in Rome and the establishment of the Vatican Observatory. And some people think, what is the Catholic Church doing with an observatory? Well, that goes all the way back to the reform of the calendar and the employment of astronomers to help figure out the exact location of the stars and so on and so forth. And so we're talking, a good 500 years ago now. All of this is kind of illustrative of the sense that we don't have anymore that religion, or in this case, the church in Western Europe, was the custodian of culture, and including scientific culture, as much as it was science in those days. Charles?
Just wanted to point out that the beginnings of the transfer of Arabic science and philosophy is at 1050 at Monte Cassino.
Right.
Because that's when Constantine the African comes over with a whole bunch of medical philosophy manuscripts. And the monastery was wise enough to assign other monks to work with him. And that's the beginning of the first curriculum in medical science, which is called the Articello.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I was going to add that, that the Iberian Peninsula is the place where all of this translation is going on from Islamic sources and Jewish. I think of, I mentioned Avicenna and Maimonides in particular, who had a great influence upon Aquinas in these areas. Now, what I want to say though, before we move on there is there is another term that is very common, because religious studies. We have a Department of Religious Studies here. We have one at Santa Clara. They're all over the country. Notice that this is not a Department of Theology, as it would have been at the university. Well, the university didn't have a department, but it's not a Department of Theology, most decidedly not. Why is that the case? Because Stanford is not an ecclesiastical institution, right? People do not study confessional theology here. Oh, church, yeah. How did we get there? How did we get to this kind of a model of studying religion in a more objective and non-theological sense? Well, I think it really began, ironically enough, in an explicit sense with the missions in the 16th century. The Jesuits had a lot to do with this because they went all over the world and studied these cultures from the inside out, actually assimilating these cultures unto themselves. So up here, for example, you have Matteo Ricci in China, and he ingratiates himself by becoming a Chinese scholar, a Mandarin. And in the course of doing that, he translates the scriptures into Mandarin. He, along with a lot of these other Jesuits, developed dictionaries, had copious illustrations of customs and so forth. So they took the religions and the cultures that they were entering very, very seriously. This is a picture of Robert de Nobili over here, these two Jesuits in India doing something very similar. This is the court of Akbar around 1600. And this is a compendium describing the nature and moral practices of Incas in Peru. So, I mean, just as an example. So what they were discovering in this period, what Europe was discovering was the religious other, shall we say. Up until that time, yes, Muslims and Jews were religious others. They were others. But now we're looking at people as religious others, okay? And so you begin, in the universities, you begin the study of rituals and myths, and you get into hermeneutics, the interpretation of texts, starting with pagan texts like Greek texts and so forth, and then moving into scriptural texts. By the 19th century, Germany gives us the research university. Stanford is a very good example of it. Does anybody recognize this? Die Luft der Freiheit weht. Huh? Isn't that amazing? That's the motto of Stanford University. Let the winds of freedom blow. And in these kinds of universities, theology was excised from the curriculum. It just was not, didn't even have to be excised, it just wasn't there, okay? This is the American university, and this is the modern secular university. And then you have the deunification of knowledge into departments and schools and so forth. And so you do end up, ultimately here at Stanford, for example, within the last 25 years or so, with a department called Religious Studies, right? But it is an example par excellence of what happened in Western culture from the time of the Middle Ages up and through modernity and then into late modernity, and the transformation of the universities into what we know them to be today. So religion then becomes a region of study. approached from a number of different kinds of methodologies. One that is famous, that most people do encounter at some point or another, is Rudolf Otto's idea of the holy, that religion has something to do with the numinous and the spiritual, the mysterium. He puts it tremendans et fascinans, the mysterious and tremendous mystery, and so forth. A lot of critiques about that. But what they establish here is a category of the sacred, which is opposed to or distinguished from the profane. Profane reality is that which lies before the temple gates.
Could you give a quick definition of numinous?
Yeah, it literally means in the clouds. It's, nebulous, yes, right. That's even better. Yes.
Profane.
Oh, profane, good. It doesn't mean cussing. It literally means before the temple. Okay. So,
What exactly is that?
well, let me give you an example. In ancient Israel, you have the temple and the Temple Mount. Okay. And the Holy of Holies was the sacred zone. That was very holy. And outside in front was where you could buy animals to hand to the priest for sacrifice. Okay, that's the profane zone. Okay.
Oh, it's like the bad zone.
No, well, it's not bad. It's just, it literally means before, coming before the temple itself, the fauna, or the faunus.
So
Okay?
like
Yeah. So it's pro, before, coming before the fauna, the temple.
So would this be like people before they reach God? Or what's a profane reality?
Profane reality it's all of reality. Today we talk about the secular world, okay?
Yeah.
But this notion of sacred and profane actually takes us back to that early period that I was talking about at the beginning, where the distinction between the two wasn't as sharply drawn.
Okay.
Yes, they were different. Only high priests went into the Holy of Holies, right? But the architecture of the temple, in one sense, represented the whole world, which was suffused with this mystery of the Holy of Holies. Okay, even the profane world.
So like, I'm just gonna say, like, the reason I'm taking this class, or not the reason, but like one of the questions is that, like, do you think everyone like gets into the sacred of sacred? I don't know. It's so confusing to me.
What was the question?
Do we all get into the Holy of Holies?
Like,
Into the,
or,
do we,
like, what do you do? To get
Here's
there?
a quick answer to this, because we're going to. What's your name again? I'm sorry.
Nolan.
Nolan.
Yeah.
We're going to be going back to this. Okay. You're getting into what we call anthropology, and an understanding of the human person as both a material creature and a self-transcending creature. Quick answer to that is, I personally, from my own theological standpoint, I do think it's a possibility for everybody. But okay, and then where we end up here, of course, is in a world where religion and science are epistemologically incompatible. That is to say, that there are two very distinct modes of knowing about reality. How did this happen? Okay. I want to start out going back to Aristotle with this whole notion of logos. The logos is something that we encounter in Greek philosophy, certainly in Aristotelian philosophy. And it literally means word, of course, but it means so much more than word. It's a principle of reason, a rational ordering principle of the whole of reality. And so it is the key to the notion that the universe, all of creation, is intelligible. This is one of the basic presuppositions for doing science. It's one of the basic presuppositions for doing theology, that the reality out there is intelligible. Now, this does not mean that it's fully comprehensible. It does not mean that we can map everything there is to be mapped about it. It doesn't mean that it can be exhaustively known. But it does mean it can be understood to some degree, and that's what we mean by intelligibility. The other thing that it guarantees is coherency, that somehow or another, this intelligibility involves things more or less hanging together as a whole. You have this great, search for the unified field theory. That's coming out of this whole search for coherence. some kind of demonstration of the coherency of the universe, which is being presupposed. So too with theology. There is some kind of presupposition of the coherence of things, of what is. But we don't have an absolute picture. We never will have an absolute picture. I think one of the most exciting things about this recent announcement about gravitational waves is the speculation that it could really be possible that we are talking about multiverses. And we don't, as the article in the New York Times said, we have no idea of the ultimate architecture of the universe. And that's exciting. So, so that doesn't mean that things aren't ultimately coherent, but it does mean that we don't have a full picture of it yet. So theology becomes a means of interpretation which rests upon logos, upon the principle, organizing principle of all things that give it intelligibility and coherency. And it allows for an asymptotic knowledge of what is. Now, an asymptote, as you know, never meets the coordinate, right? But it strives to. It keeps moving. And that's the kind of knowledge we're talking about, certainly in theology, and often enough in the sciences as well, as Oliver will point out. What all of this does is establish the basis for a way of thinking in the West called faith and reason. Very quickly, I'm not going to go through all of these points because we need to take some time to break shortly. But there are three major contributors here in addition to Maimonides and Avicenna and others who contribute to this in the West. The first is Augustine. Augustine is a Platonist. So he believes that truth somehow has descended upon all of us, and it's up to us to, in a certain sense, find out what it is. Okay? And we do that through reasoning. But the thing about Augustine is that the powers of reason are limited. The powers of reason are limited. So if you, to put this into theology, into theological terms, if you want to talk about faith and the content of faith and an understanding of faith, you have to understand that from an Augustinian standpoint, reason is only going to take you so far. There's still this realm of mystery. There's this realm of the inexplicable for Augustine. So one way of understanding this is that is this phrase here, intellectus quaerens fidem. The understanding is in search of faith. That somehow our minds, our capacities for reasoning, are ultimately leading us, in Augustine's mind, toward faith. That is that is what gives all knowledge its finality and meaning, its entelechy, its inner meaning. This truth that is given in faith. Okay, so you have, with Augustine, you have the limitations of reason vis-a-vis faith. Then you get Anselm. And Anselm is the one who gives us that very famous quotation, fides quaerens intellectum. It's just the other way around, faith in search of understanding, right? And Anselm is a rationalist, a medieval rationalist, and he believes that faith needs to explicate itself rationally and that can be done. And there are rational structures that exist for understanding faith quite apart from revelation, quite apart from the stuff you get in the Bible, quite apart from the stuff you get from church. That if we use our minds, we use our reason, we can arrive at some understanding of faith. So this is faith seeking an understanding of itself through the use of the powers of reason. All right? So with Anselm, he's going to lead some thinkers in a very abstract direction where the experience of God is not going to be all that important. Because you're relying so much on your mind, on the powers of reason, that the experience of God, all that stuff that's given in Revelation, can be kind of bracketed and put aside. Okay? Thomas Aquinas. And here are some of the people upon whom he relies, by the way. Up on the upper left is Albert the Great, who was his teacher who was probably a better scientist than Thomas, one of the luminaries of his day. This is Avicenna here, 9th century Muslim philosopher and physician. And this is Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher of the 12th century. And these guys were translated, as Gerald mentioned, on the Iberian Peninsula in the monasteries.
North
And
Africa also, North Africa.
yeah, okay. And their translations made their way into Aquinas' workshop. I say his workshop because, he, like many great scholars, he didn't do all of this on his own. He had people taking notes, and as he was walking along, they were writing it down. He did have an incredible mind. But, anyway, okay. What Thomas Aquinas accomplishes, 13th century, great Dominican theologian and philosopher, is a kind of a synthesis, as we say, of faith and reason. He doesn't even use the word theology. He uses the word sacra doctrina in the first part of the Summa Theologia, or roughly translated sacred doctrine, sacred teaching. And he says that it is a scientia, it is a way of knowing that's based on certain self-evident principles. Some of those are given in nature, some of those are given in revelation. Okay? But what he wants to say, contrary to Augustine, is that in fact reason can sufficiently give us at least some kind of basic conclusion about the content of faith, in particular about God. Not everything, but can get us, to the doorstep, shall we say. There's more involved when it actually comes to the act of faith itself. Unlike Anselm, he does not want to bracket out the experience of faith. He doesn't want to bracket out the experience of God. He says the words that we utter about God ultimately generate love. Verbum spirans amorum. Okay? They generate love. So the finality of his theology is something very affective, very much felt. All right. So he gives us this great synthesis in what we call the in many of his in very many of his works. Then after this period, we go through a series of paradigm shifts. Obviously Kepler, Copernicus, and Galileo, the whole fallout from the Galileo affair, which we'll be looking at. There's also Newtonian physics, which are studied by a Jesuit theologian, Michael J. Buckley, in his book, At the Origins of Modern Atheism, in which he demonstrates that Newton still wanted his physics to somehow provide some kind of a demonstration for a warrant for faith. But it was picked up by various theologians, including Samuel Clarke, an Anglican theologian in England, who tried to do a theology that was based simply upon Newtonian physics. And that led to various kinds of criticisms, including among the French philosophes of the Enlightenment. And then you have this famous line from Laplace, have no need of the hypothesis of God. So what Buckley argues is that very gradually, with perhaps the best of intentions, Christian theologians are the ones who actually gave rise to modern atheism in a philosophic sense. We also have the rise of pragmatism, positivism. I'm reading through William James, for example. He's not a positivist, but he's a pragmatist. And for whom religion involves aspirations to the higher things and feeling states and so forth. We get a real turn with Feuerbach, for whom God is nothing more than a projection of human beings' deepest aspirations, desires, wants, wishes, and so forth. And he gives us the framework for Nietzsche's work, as well as Freud's and Marx's. And then you can see how this develops. Did anybody get to the lecture by Richard Carney today? Did you get there? Okay, so Carney represents a new wrinkle in all of this. He is neither an agnostic nor an atheist. He is kind of an uneasy theist who is trying to find new ways of talking about theism in this very changed kind of situation that we're in today. We're almost finished here, but what I want to just summarize here is what happened then, because the question was how did this happen? What happened when, as a result of all of these paradigm shifts, that sense of logos that we found in the origins of Western thought basically dropped out. So that today we don't talk about metaphysics usually. Very few scientists sit down and seriously talk about it, but very few theologians do either. Sad to say, but that's where we are. Okay. So what happens is faith becomes understood as an irrational leap. You get a little bit of that in Kierkegaard, but the emphasis here is on irrational. And so religion becomes a realm of experience. It's primarily kind of personal experience, often a privatized experience. It's something that isn't subject to demonstration, much less to polite conversation, right? The pre-modern sacred versus the profane becomes the religious versus the secular. And the secular becomes a stand-in for the so-called scientific worldview. Okay? So, to go back to the very beginning of that little conversation with George Klein and Richard Dawkins, that's an example of that. Faith is reduced to experiential claims that can't be verified as opposed to reason and hence to science. And quite honestly, some forms of faith, or what people claim to be faith, do fit that description. But I would say that a more sophisticated understanding of faith would not have to follow that. And so faith becomes intellectually superfluous, especially when we examine some of the forms of religion that express it. So in other words, we have a number of the newer atheists today who pretty much, and I see some of this in Bertrand Russell as well, throw the baby out with the bathwater because religion itself is so corrupted, or it's caused so many problems, been a source of so many wars, and so on and so forth, that therefore the claims that people make under the umbrella of religion, claims of faith, can also be dispensed with. Finally, I would just say that there are other metaphysical possibilities, which we won't be going into much in this course. There's Teilhard de Chardin, who's a Jesuit scholar, paleontologist, who left us some very fascinating works. We have the process approach from Whitehead. What you read today for tonight was not actually an example of process theology, more of historical essay. The transcendental ontological approach, which Oliver will be talking about. The post-structuralist, Carney is a very good example of that. There are some people who are approaching all of this through the rubric of beauty. The Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, and the British theologian Sarah Coakley. She does wonderful, wonderful work. And then Catherine Tanner at Yale is phenomenal. I just love her stuff. But these are people who are trying to, they're sifting through they're sifting through the shards of metaphysics and are trying to reconstruct something so that we can talk to one another and that we can, again, claim some kind of basis for intelligibility and coherence as we do either theology or science. So that's the end of my little presentation, and I think what we're going to do now is take a break.
What Paul was doing really nicely, I thought, this was great, giving you an idea about what theology is about, the evolution of theology, the presuppositions that go into theology, into faith, into these reflections, these systematic reflections on faith. What I would like to, oh, by the way, I apologize right away. I know my voice doesn't carry as well as a well-trained Jesuit priest. I'll do my very best, including taking lessons from him eventually. Hopefully down the road we will, well, actually we will have other speakers, so it won't matter anymore, but maybe we will have some PA system going. But please tell me if I'm too quiet. I will start to speak up a little louder and then drift off and be quiet again, and then you tell me again. All right. What I want to do today, here now is I want to talk to you about roughly what the question what science is. What are the presuppositions that go into science that make science possible in the first place? Right, so what I would like to do is really generally asking questions like how can science be defined and characterized? And what are the metaphysical presuppositions that make science possible? Now that's something where a lot of scientists get very uneasy. I had these conversations with scientists as a scientist and a theologian, and I would say, you know, you can only do science if you have metaphysical presuppositions worked out. And they get very upset because metaphysics is what you find at the bookstores right next to crystals and, you know, that sort of thing. They don't want to have anything to do with that. That's not what scientists do. They do the hardcore stuff. But I want to tell you why there are metaphysical presuppositions and why you have to have them, because otherwise you cannot do science. And then hopefully, if time permits, we can talk a little bit about what common scientific practices are, how we can philosophically reflect on those practices, how philosophers have done that. We'll see how we do on time. Okay. Now, what are these presuppositions? Before I talk about that, let me start with giving you a short idea of what I mean by metaphysics. I mean, Paul said a lot about metaphysics, and it should be quite clear. At the same time, you ask 10 different philosophers or theologians, you get 10 different answers. So I feel I should give you at least a rough idea of what I'm talking about. So the way I would define it here is an attempt to discover principles of ultimate reality with the goal of understanding being. And understanding being here, I mean, again, if you remember last time when I made that distinction, albeit a little awkward, Simon, I know, but the distinction between ontology and epistemology, ontology being the question about being itself and how to relate to it and understand it, that's what I mean by understanding being. Or as Karl Rahner, a Jesuit theologian, once said, the metaphysics is the question about the being of being as such, the question about the meaning of being. Okay. Now that putting forth, let's say a little bit more about how that might be important for the natural sciences. Why would be metaphysics important for natural scientists? That brings me to the question why, you know, the question that made them so aggressive when I talked to some of them. The first thing is that science cannot define itself. I mean, that's very obvious. You cannot do a scientific experiment to show what science is and how it has to work, right? So something has to be in play before you can do science in the first place. And whatever is in play there cannot be scientific, it has to be philosophical, or as I would say, metaphysical. Science studies beings, beings that have being. Now, it may not ask the question what that meaning means. It may ask what it is and how it works, but ultimately, the question what it means lures. And if we take Aristotle there seriously, that men or human beings want to know, want to understand what meaning is, well, that would be actually what this all would lead to. Now, science studies the causal and historical relationships of what? Of beings, right? It does so in a way that presupposes things without further questioning them. Like what? We'll talk about some of those in a second, but for example, that there are beings. That's a presupposition. It's nothing that follows from the science, right? Because it studies the relationship of them. And without these presuppositions, science would simply be impossible. Okay, now what are these presuppositions? The first one that I want to give you is a very simple one. It's simply the principle of objectivity, or common sense realism, which basically means there is an observer-independent world out there, right? Scientists would have to assume that there is a world out there no matter whether we are there or not. If it weren't there, well, it could be that the world is just mentally in our minds. There is no other world out there. You are just figments of my imagination. That could or could not be true, but for a scientist that would not be very productive, because then there's nothing to study. So Solipsism, which has this notion that reality only exists in the mind, is not necessarily a good starting place for the natural sciences. Right? But why can scientists assume that with certainty? I mean, it could very well be that I am a figment of your imagination. I mean, I don't believe that, but prove me wrong. Right? Prove me wrong that I'm not in your head. Good luck. I would think if you did attempt to, we wouldn't get anywhere. That's another question. So the assumption that there's an observer-independent world out there is an assumption that scientists have to make on, well, experience, an interpretation of that experience, and therefore on, may I say it, dare I say it, faith. Okay? So it's an irrational principle. Right? I mean, there's no rational foundation here to assume that is how it is. Now, the text that some of you may have gotten time to read, I hope, right? Yes, lie to me? Okay. It's Alfred North Whitehead's Science of the Modern World. It's actually a series of lectures, and we read the first one. And in this lecture, what Whitehead is really trying to do is talk about these presuppositions. What are these presuppositions that scientists have to have in order to do science? And where do they come from? What is Whitehead on about in this text? Well, basically the thesis is that there was a silent revolution that went hand in hand with the scientific revolution of the 17th century. And the silent revolution of science has reshaped human mentality so that formerly exceptional ways of thinking are now widely adopted throughout the educated world. And he says actually this stuff is more important than the actual science that was revolutionizing the way that we investigated the world. The new mentality.
Example of how our mentality is.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Give me a chance. The new mentality, he says, is more important even than the new science and the technology that came out of that revolution. He says it has altered the metaphysical presuppositions and the imaginative contents of our minds so that now the old stimuli provoke a new response. You see the world differently because you have different assumptions about reality. Right? Now, what are the ones that he's talking about? Now I'm coming to answering your question over the next few minutes. The first one that he gives is the order of nature. It's an important one. Scientists have to assume that there is an order within nature. There are causes and related effects. You have to assume that. Now he says that this is an instinctive conviction. Now that seems odd, because if I take this and I hit, I don't know, Simon over the head, then the bump on his head has a clear cause, me. And I would never do that. But, you know, on the other hand, for class sakes, I'm going to come over here. No. Okay.
Does this statement bar the use of the word only?
I'm sorry, what? That's
The
what?
statement that followed the title.
Yes, the instinctive conviction that things in nature are connected by cause.
Only by cause and effect.
No.
Well, say more. I'm not entirely sure what you're after.
Does this mean less than if one put an only between the by and the cause?
Is there something other than cause and effect that connects
Well-
things in nature?
Right, and you could say that this leads actually to an only, yes. It depends on how you work with it and interpret it, right? And how far you want to take it. And again, if I have a little more time at the end, we'll see how that goes. We'll talk about logical positivism where you would actually say, yes, that's all there is, right? What Whitehead is after is simply to say, well, you have to assume that to do science. Now, you could be a scientist and say, I have to do that to assume science, but that's not all there is. But it's all I can concern myself with in science, right? The important thing here is that this assumption is not scientific to be gained. It has to be there in order to do science in the first place. That's the important part. That's why there's a metaphysical and not a physical presupposition. Yes?
Can't you derive it from experience?
Well, yes.
It doesn't have to be an assumption. You look at something, I hit it, he cries.
Yes.
I hit him, he cries.
Yes.
Then I say there's a cause between not hitting him and him crying.
Yes.
It's not an assumption.
Well, it's an assumption to begin with that it happens really and not only in your head. It's the first assumption you would have to have in order to say that that's not an assumption but a real thing, right? And experience, if that is an experience and you say that experiences are not merely assumptions, but experiences give you truth, then what about religious experiences?
Consider another modification of that statement.
Yeah.
Where it says, things in nature are sometimes connected by cause and effect. There'd still be room for science to find out what are those cases.
Oh, he has no problem with that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there is no cause and effect in nature. All I'm saying is the assumption that there is a cause and effect is something that you don't get scientifically, you get it metaphysically through experience and interpretation of experience. It's irrational. There's no rationality here.
Well,
There's
it depends on what you mean by rationality.
Of course,
There's
but
no,
there is
there,
no
there
reason.
might not be a deductive or reasoning to say.
Well, let me follow through with that, and I hopefully will respond to your question when it comes to inductive and deductive logic. What Whitehead is saying is that the contradiction of the scientific project, namely to claim rationality without a reason that justifies the underlying principle of nature's order, is resolved by a metaphysical presupposition, namely that there is an order, period. And he asks why that is, why that exists. He still calls it an instinctive conviction, but he asks why is there this idea that there's an origin, an idea of this order of nature. And he says, obviously the main recurrences of life, here we come to experiences, are too insistent to escape the notice of the least rational of humans. And even before the dawn of rationality, they have impressed themselves upon the instincts of animals. It is unnecessary to labor the point that in a broad outline certain general states of nature recur, and that our very natures have adapted themselves to such repetitions. Fair enough. But, and here's the problem. It's twofold. First, to reason the universal from the individual is basically inductive logic. As we know from Hume, and I will talk about this a little more, so don't get nervous. I'll unpack this once more. So we know from Hume, inductive logic is not convincing. There's no reason to believe just because something happened 5,000 times, it will happen again. Right? So if you conclude the general from the individual, you would have to actually have a problem. Just because a thing happened numerous times, no reason it should happen again. The second reason, as Whitehead points out, is yes, it seems as if we have reliable, repeatable experiences of the same things, but there never are really two occurrences that are identical. The two really identical occurrences that we know in the sciences have to actually presuppose all that stuff. If you talk about identicals in science, you have to presuppose all that. Otherwise, you can't get there. Right?
So what conclusion can you draw if many occurrences are identical?
If you have many occurrences that would be identical, you can make a clear rational, you can make a claim that you have cause and effect, and you can build on that cause and effect conclusion. You can build your entire epistemology in the natural sciences. What he's saying is there is no reason to believe that because there are no identical occurrences. Yet if you talk about science, or if you look at how science works, that is something you need to assume. That's really what he's saying. Yeah?
Are you saying there are no two occurrences that are identical? Is that true because it is time, and that what occurs this instant has gone, and the second occurrence is the new occurrence?
Yeah.
Well,
Mathematics is only conceptual and only in the mind, but experiences are never the same. I mean,
Well, we experience certain things and say they're the same because they seem very, very much the same. That's what he's arguing. The point is, if you look closer, are they really always the same? No, they're not. Now, why that is? Well, you could say if we assume time to begin with, we would have the passing of equal things, units of time. And then you would have actually the occurrence of the same thing all over, a repeatable occurrence. What he's saying is basically we assume this regularity on the interpretation of our experiences without having any reason to assume that they really are the same.
When did it occur to primitive man that the rising of the sun was going to continue happening?
That's a good question. I mean, we would have to ask primitive man about that. I would say that's something, I would say that's something that goes far back. But the problem is, as Hume says, there's no reason to believe that will always be the case. And in 500,000 years, Hume will be proven right, because our sun will go nova.
Well, the probability of it being different was being
Well, when you work with probabilities, you're already assuming regularities. You already have those presuppositions in place. You see, you can't get yourself out of that space.
Just to contextualize this historically,
Yeah.
when was Hume making?
This was in the 18th century.
Okay, thanks.
I like to say to my students, you know, you have a fat Scotsman and then you have a hell of a lot of problems. But he really put his finger on something. Right? Now, Whitehead asks where this idea of the regularity comes from. And he goes back and says, well, it's actually an influence that Greek drama, Greek thinking, the way that the Greeks saw the world, affected the philosophy of nature. According to Greek drama, things work out according to their destiny. And that thinking has shaped the presuppositions of Greek natural philosophy, which has then affected the way that we do science. As Whitehead says, fate in Greek tragedy becomes the order of nature in modern thought. This remorseless inevitableness is what pervades scientific thought. The laws of physics are the decrees of fate. Now, at that point, he asks, I think, a very intriguing question. And he says, okay, we have this Greek influence, right? Now, why did the scientific revolution unfold in the 17th century in Europe, and not before in Europe or elsewhere? And here he makes a claim that is highly disputed. But that's, of course, fine. That's an interesting challenge. He says scientific thinking as we find it in the scientific revolution of the 17th century did not occur in ancient Greece, except in one person, to some degree. What was that? Somebody suggest one?
Aristotle.
Aristotle. Exactly. Right?
Was there no example of this in prehistoric China?
No, we don't
No.
know.
That's the point. No.
definition.
You can't.
They invented
Well, you don't have in prehistoric China. You did not have what you find in 17th century Europe emerging into the scientific method.
but they invented gunpowder long before the 17th century.
There's a difference between
And that
trial
was
and
a dependable, repetitive
Yep.
operation.
Yep. There's a difference between trial and error and hypothesis testing. I can achieve a lot with trial and error. You asked about the early hominids and early humans. They had, at least, if you go back, you find it pretty much as, even in pre-Homo times, you will find that they have tools, stone tools, some of them being made. How you make that tool had nothing to do with sitting there and coming up with a plan. It was something that you tried. It was trial and error. You can achieve a lot of that, but that's not what happens in the 17th century. There's a shift in how you do science. It's not trial and error anymore. As a matter of fact, if you're a scientist and you do trial and error, you get in a hell lot of problem with your colleagues. Right? I mean, they will tell you that's not science.
So the apple tree was not science.
No, the apple tree was a nice story. It didn't happen. But that was not science. That was what that shows is actually another thing. It shows that creativity is an important part of doing science. And it does so in a nice story, just like biblical stories tell us something about other experiences. Right? So what do we get from Aristotle? We get inductive reasoning. And why do we get inductive reasoning from Aristotle? What is it to begin with? Well, Greek philosophy worked primarily with deductive reasoning. And that's a very reliable way of coming to a conclusion, right? You start basically with a general principle, and from that you come to your individual specific conclusion. So what would be a typical example for the students? Can you give me a good example for deductive
All
reasoning?
apples fall from trees.
Well, as I meant the students here, the undergrads. Any ideas?
All apples fall from trees.
It's a good one. It's a good one. And then what? Then saying gravity would be a jump. No, it's simply a syllogism, okay? You start with a general statement, all men are mortal, okay? Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So you work yourself from a general statement down to the individual.
Let's try applying this to Jesus.
No.
No, that's not. Because I'm talking about,
This is religion and science.
yep, and we're now talking about science before we can actually relate those two constructively. So before we know what we're talking about, when we want to talk about these things, we have to unpack these other aspects, the foundational aspects, carefully. So I would say, let's keep that question going, or we can talk about it after class. I'm happy to. Okay. The problem with deductive reasoning is, of course, what? Why is deductive reasoning problematic? I mean, it works great, right? All men are mortals, la 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 la. The logic is,
Well, you have to assume the general principles.
where does it come from, right? Where does the general principle come from? That was exactly the question that Aristotle asked, and he said, well, we can reverse that actually. We can do it inductively. The general principle can be construed from individual observations, which are abstracted into propositions. That's the case in propositional logic. So if I say all humans ever observed eventually died, therefore all humans are mortal. And then I can go back into my deductive reasoning, right? So here, what you have with this inductive reasoning, it seems this is what science does. It looks at individual cases. It collects data points, individual observations, right? Now, why did that not go further then with Greek philosophy, natural philosophy, to really bring about this this scientific revolution? That was Whitehead's question. His answer to that question is this: what was lacking was a fundamental idea that came out of medieval thought, strongly influenced by Stoics. Here you have the idea of order going into the social order, yes, that's one important thing, but the other thing is High Middle Ages became hyper-rational, and from that perspective of hyper-rationalism, Whitehead argues the important scholastic contribution is the assumption that events are causally linked to their antecedents, and that the universe holds secrets, that's the important thing, that can be unveiled. This is what Paul said earlier, is the idea that the universe is intelligible. And Whitehead suggests the following solution to the problem, and I'm not sure that he's entirely wrong, I'm not sure that he's entirely right either. What he's suggesting is this: he says, what is the origin of this premise? Well, the medieval idea of God. Scholastic theology was hyper-rational. The assumption was that a rational God has created a rational universe, which has underlying natural laws. These natural laws are rational, and we happen to be created in what way? We're created in the image of God. So therefore, we are rational beings, and as rational beings are capable of understanding the rational laws that this rational God wrote into creation. So what he suggests, that is Whitehead, is really the intelligibility of nature is the third presupposition that would come out of Christian theology. Now, why am I a little critical of that? Because Christian theology at the time was highly Hellenistic. I mean, a lot of that came out of Greek philosophy, Greek natural philosophy. So you could actually push the case further and could say the intelligibility of nature was something that also the Greeks assumed for different reasons, right? Certainly for different reasons. But for Whitehead, this presupposition, which has to be taken by any scientist, every scientist has to assume that nature is intelligible. Otherwise, they don't have to do their bit. Whitehead suggests that this is something that Western science actually got from Western theology. That's a strong claim, but certainly an interesting one. Now, the fourth metaphysical presupposition would be that nature is measurable. That goes along with the intelligibility to some degree. But the assumption that our measurements that we take of nature have actually representations, reliable representations of reality, is an assumption. You can't get that from measuring nature. That would not work. I mean, you have to assume that your measurements of nature are reliable. You assume them in consonance with the other metaphysical presuppositions. And then finally, of course, I would argue the fifth one would be the universality of laws in nature. Once everything is given, if all things given are equal, you will get the same thing no matter where you are. So we can actually figure out here on Earth what counts elsewhere in the universe and what would happen there. These 5 metaphysical presuppositions have to be in place before you can actually do science. You cannot get any of these from the science. That would put the cart before the horse. Now, at this point, we're not talking theology. We're just talking philosophy of science. Is that clear? Are there any questions here? Sure.
Well, when we talk about the measurability of nature, I think the Higgs boson pursuit illustrates the cost of building CERN and using it to look for the Higgs boson was enormous.
Yes.
The next particle beyond that is going to be even bigger by a huge order of magnitude. And so there's a natural limit by the size of the Earth and its content of energy, etc., on the measurability of nature.
Yes, but you assume that if it were measurable, in theory, it's measurable. It's not an ontological, inconsistent uncertainty. That would be what is at work in quantum mechanics. This is an epistemological problem.
I think it's a certainty that we'll never be able to measure the ultimate properties of nature.
Yes, but theoretically it would be possible. I mean, it's not an ontological uncertainty. There are certain things in quantum mechanics that are ontologically uncertain, at least in accordance to some scientists who would interpret it that way. But here is something that if I had the energy, I might very well be able to do that. Now, I agree with you that we probably won't find, well, I actually don't know, I'm not a physicist.
It's intractable.
What do I know? What?
It's an intractable problem. It's not an
It's an
insoluble
intractable,
problem.
yeah, exactly. It's intractable, very good,
That's
yeah.
the word.
And you know, it could very well be that one day we figure that out. I don't know if that's the case. We have to ask physicists. I'm not a physicist. I'm a biologist, so I will refrain from making any claims as strong as you did. But
so everything beyond that would be beyond.
No, it could be philosophy, for example, natural philosophy.
There are higher energy particles known from cosmic rays and what they can generate in a collider like the galaxy. So
Right.
the fact that you can't do it on demand doesn't mean you can't observe it or draw conclusions
Right.
about what's going on.
So, but the important thing for me here is a very different one, whether that is possible or not. The important thing here is what they do at CERN presupposes this. No matter what particle or whatever they are looking for, that's what is presupposed, and that's important. These presuppositions don't follow from the science, yes.
Is it possible, though, that the instinctive desire to find order, which is part of the theological urge, the urge to find a prime mover, and maybe the same fount of the urge to find, through scientific method, observable laws of the universe, but they don't necessarily end at the prime mover.
Yes.
So they're not, they may come from the same human instinct, but they aren't necessarily
Absolutely,
connected.
absolutely, yes. No problem there. It's not my point. My point is when you do science, you engage in an epistemological business of trying to make knowledge claims about reality. The way that you make knowledge claims about reality in science is you pursue these questions that you ask in a particular way.
No, but I think that's not entirely honest, because what White is trying, I think, is trying to say is that in fact there is a connection.
There's what?
That there is a connection. That there
Between-
is between the faith or the search for prime mover and scientific method. So, well, you're acting as, you're saying this as if it's just epistemological reality, it's just philosophic. But actually, he's writing in 1925, and I think
Yes.
he is, in fact, and he eventually goes on to, in essence, create process theology. Or
Right. No, he does process philosophy,
Fine,
process
but it
theology,
becomes-
with theologians who
I
do
get
process
it, but
theology.
he's, I think it is beyond that. I think it's an attempt to
Sure.
to try and.
Sure, but that was not your question. You asked me, is it possible to hold these and not go there where he wants to go? And I say, yes, it's possible. Right?
But I don't think that's where you're going.
Where I'm going, no. It's not where he's going, it's not where I'm going, but is it possible? Yes. That's it's true.
At least in the biological sciences, if everything could be evolved in a random way to result in the order that we have today, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is any inherent order as far as biological science is concerned. It could be any kind of order. It's just a product of random
No, it's not.
events.
It's not. As a matter of fact, if you do it just on very simple terms, biological evolution has two. I mean, there are more players. I'll jump right in here. I missed something out. I missed something here. He's a PhD in evolutionary biology, so we'll refer to him if I mess this up. But here's the thing. In simplest terms, what is random is the diversity on which natural selection acts. Natural selection does not act randomly. On the contrary, natural selection is very directed. It's just that on what it can act comes about randomly. That's a very important distinction. Is that fair? You can.
I have to think.
Okay. I mean, the biological diversity that you get from where? You get it from mutations, you get it from sexual recombination, and now I'm happy to bring in other things like epigenetics, genetic effects, and so forth. But those things happen, mutations, as far as we know, absolutely unpredictable. Right? They're random. Sexual recombination actually is absolutely random. I mean, yes, you get the genetic material from your dad or your mom, there's, that's there, but then the recombination of the germ cells before they actually fuse and kind of shake around the genetic material during meiosis, that's random. So that's the random bit. But it's absolutely not random that if there's a gazelle and me and there's a lion that I will lose out. That's just because I can't run fast. And that's very directed. Natural selection will eat me because, well, the lion will eat me because I'm slow. That's a very directed process. Okay? And what I have to assume, actually, if I go into evolutionary theory in detail, the way that we think about evolutionary theory today, we would actually have to say, well, though genetics might not be deterministic, there is still a genetic cause for certain things that we find in the phenotype. And yes, we can go about the whole question of a phenotype and genotype as a distinction. So it's not quite all random.
Just a quick question when it comes to phenotype, genotype,
Yes.
biology. But with Aristotle, I think, had a comment about our accidental selves. And when it comes to, I know that it's still a bit early for this, but when it comes to linking who we are and why we are in a theological viewpoint where we are because of that, and then in moving that into this random phase where we are what we are because of a bunch of combinations of all of these things, is there a way that we can move those together?
Yes, there is. I mean, that goes back to the question that you were asking me, actually. I believe there is, and we will talk about this over the course of the class. Yes, there is. I believe there is. Now, of course, if you don't have faith, there's no reason that you reflect on it. The question is, and this is I don't want to put words into your mouth, Paul, but you said that the intersection can't actually be reached by everyone. I would interpret that to mean that the human being, if there is a God, is actually created in such a way that the question about the intersection to begin with is something that is given to us. And it is given to us by that God. So if that's the case, then you can actually frame that further, yes. I don't know, I lost.
And the question on teleology, Aristotle, had the four causes. And would you say there's any teleology in these metaphysical, because that's a debate in philosophy of science today. Some philosophers are claiming you can't have the mind without some principle of teleology. I don't know. Maybe we're going to get into that later.
Yeah, I think that's one of those questions where we could probably spend the next 5 days in the barn and never go to sleep.
But in those 5, do you see any teleology?
Well,
Okay, wait, before you
Well,
start.
what is teleology?
okay, very good question. Sorry. Aristotle speaks of 4 causes. You have a material cause of things. If you think about a statue of Aristotle, the material cause would be the stuff that the statue is made of, so marble, let's say. Okay. The second cause would be the formal cause. That's a little more tricky to understand. It's the essence of the stuff that actually causes something. For Aristotle, beings were actually the actualized possibility of being. This possibility of being he called the prime matter, which is a metaphysical concept of the possibility of something that can be actualized. What actualizes this? The essence. And the essence is the informing principle, or the forma, the informing principle that actualizes the possibility of being and gives it being. That would be the formal cause. And then we have the efficient cause, and the efficient cause for the, so in case of the marble, it would be the essence of the marble, what makes marble, or the stuff that marble is made of, actually, because it's not just marble, it's other things, elementary particles, and so, okay, fine. The next cause that he's talking about is the efficient cause. And the efficient cause would be that what science is dealing with. The efficient cause would be, well, the forces, the physical forces that actually shape that thing. So you have a hammer, a chisel, and an artist who chisels that out of the marble. That would be the series of efficient causes that causes this statue, right? That's what science studies. Now, the last one is the final cause. That would be teleology. And what is the final cause of a statue of Aristotle?
What's in your head?
No. To remind us of Aristotle, of course.
What's in your head?
I mean, yeah, okay, when you mean that by what is in your head, sorry, I don't have that much in there, so you have to apologize if I said no. But yes, I mean, if that's what you have in your head before you start putting the chisel to the hammer, and the idea is you want to make Aristotle, so I can remind you that there was a guy who came up with 4 choices, then I can talk about this in class, and so it goes on and on and on. That would be the teleology. The final cause is
First
that.
in intention is last in execution, according to Aristotle.
Yes.
Or you can call it.
What
purpose,
did
right?
you say?
The first in intention is last in execution.
Right.
So you have the idea of the statue
Right.
first, but it's
But
last
it
in
is
execution.
what it leads to. So now, is there teleology in this? Well, I would say yes. I think there is much room for teleology, but that's of course because I am a theologian as well. Fides credemus intellectum, do I believe? Yes. It would be my faith that there is a personal creator God who creates us in a particular way, and that exactly this sense of wonder and awe is given to us. Now, you could argue that some of these things then could be teleological, right? But do you have to argue that? No. Even if I don't argue that they are teleological, even if I don't argue that they are given to us by God, as a scientist I still have to hold them, I have to explain where they're coming from. And whatever I come up with an explanation, it will remain irrational. That's my point. Yes?
So we are comparing science and religion. And you are saying in both cases there's some foundation or assumption that we don't understand as human being. But if you're going in science, I can do things. I can have some assumption. Maybe I don't have the foundation, but based on what I can get results. As technology, I can create some technology. Look at religion. You don't have anything that I can, based on all the things that I'm doing, to create something or to use it in practical way.
Okay. Now, what you're saying is anything, I'm putting words in your mouth now just to provoke you a little bit. Okay, so throw your shoe at me or something if I'm getting off here. Okay, but I will do it anyway. What you're saying is as long as it's not practical, it's really of no use. It sounds to me as if you're saying if it's not practical, it is actually of no use.
No, I don't say it's not used. What I say is there's building on top of it.
Yes.
And you don't have something to demonstrate, maybe not to prove, but to demonstrate that
Right.
there's some validity to it.
But what would you allow as evidence?
Okay, so in science, we have some building technology. So it's,
But what would
maybe
you,
the technology is not there. Maybe it's
But
just
what-
my imagination.
right, but at what point would you say, even outside of science, at what point would you say, I have enough evidence to say here's something real? Because you say that in religion we don't have evidence. So the question is, what evidence would you allow in order to say, now I can go with this?
Something like in science. More
Right.
scientific.
But you're saying that invertedly is basically that science is the only way to the truth.
It's only way that I can act on or can.
Right, so, but what you're saying is I need scientific evidence in order to know something to be true.
No, I say that based on science, I can do something.
Right.
I can create something. I can make some assumption. Maybe I don't have proof for you. I mean, the foundation is missing.
So
but
now
I
we don't
create
have
some-
proof, okay.
I don't have a proof, but I can
Okay.
do something. I can build on it, and I can create some medicine, for example.
Right.
That's
And the efficiency of the medicine would tell you what?
that it means that I
The
think
assumption was
something
true.
that's likely to be maybe not true, absolutely true,
Right,
but
right,
it's something
exactly.
that I can.
Exactly.
I can
And certainly, even if you don't have it worked out entirely, since it works, you have to hit on something that's true, right? So the goal is to practically solve an issue of how things work and explain them in order to achieve something else. Now, in faith, you would not necessarily do that in order to heal someone with a vaccine. That's not to say that you would not use the vaccine when it's there. But you deal with something else. You deal with questions of meaning. In science, you can provide an experiment to tell me what the meaning of my life is. That doesn't work. But I can't give you scientific evidence because it's not a question of efficient causation. I can give you scientific evidence to show you that my faith has something that is justifiable to everyone based on measurable data. But hang on one second. I mean, as I said last time, what that brings you to, if you go that route to say that scientific evidence is the only one that I can rely on, you're making a truth claim, a claim that seems to be true, that you hold to be true, that is not scientific. And if that's the case, you have actually gotten yourself into a paradox. Because you say that science is the only reliable way to the truth, but there's no scientific way of proving that claim.
No, I think it's efficient. It's a way for me to create something that helps me in some stuff. Or help the unit.
Well, okay, now we have come a long way from what you said before, but if you say now it's something that helps me, I would say it helps me with certain practical questions, that's true. But if I have a question about what it means to be me, what it means to be mortal in this world, what it means to love, what it means to exist, those questions cannot be answered by an experiment.
That's right, but there's many religious practices, that people are doing it because of religion.
Yes.
And so they're doing something, they're acting, they're
Right.
doing something,
Right.
some assumption, for example, of future world or something.
Right.
So there's no way to demonstrate, to see efficiency, or to demonstrate anything about the validity of those assumptions.
Well, again, the validity you want is a scientific validity. And of course you cannot prove it scientifically because that's not the question. It's not a scientific question. The question of meaning is not a scientific question. You can use science in order to address the question of meaning. Let's move on to another question.
To think about, or ask a question about the nature of this set of presumptions.
Yes.
So of all the possible sets of metaphysical presumptions you could have to base our natural science on, how does this set compare? Does it have the least number of presumptions in it? Does it have the weakest presumptions that are possible to allow the natural science we have to be worked on?
I would just say-
I don't think it's necessary that this set is arbitrary.
No, it's not, but you could, of course, come up with others. To me, these are the 5 that have to be in work, minimum requirement in order to do scientific work. Does that answer the question, or am I popping out of your question?
Well, it does answer the question, but I think one of the points you seem to be raising is that science, like religion, makes assumptions about certain things. But the nature of the assumptions, I think, are different in the different cases. So, for instance, a scientist might say, well, this is the minimal set of assumptions we need, so it's not worth talking about anymore.
Well, yes, but the problem, what I'm trying to get at here is if you assume that science has assumptions that do not follow from the science, you can no longer address the problem of religion and science from a naive realist perspective like the logical positivists or like the logical positivists in short pants, Richard Dawkins and so forth. At that point, what you have opened up is a conversation that is far deeper. Right? Now you have a possibility of talking about, exchanging about experiences and asking questions like, okay, well, I think there are these assumptions that based on these experiences, and these experiences are more reliable than those, but, well, we can have a conversation about experiences and the role of experiences because all of these require experiences.
The most important question hasn't been asked. And that's what's the address of the bar that we can convene at?
Question. I'm game. You name it. We're over there. If you're buying, I'm there. You had a question. Somebody here had a question.
I have a question. So with like, I guess the process of scientific theory is that you test it, and then eventually if it doesn't work, then there's something that, you know, it's no longer a scientific theory. You have to like change and figure things out. Like,
I was hoping to get to that. I mean, this is something that if you go into the philosophy of science, where it gets very tricky, induction, the problem of induction, which was at work for a long time in the natural sciences, is, as Hume says, that there is no reason for this. You cannot have an assumption on something that has not that you haven't experienced yet entirely on the basis of assumptions of something that you entirely on the experiences that you had before.
yeah.
There's no logical pushing pointer.
So,
So
okay.
okay, go ahead. Maybe I'm
I guess like so in that sense, like I understand. I mean, I understand
Yes.
that completely. Like science is evolving. I guess as you learn more things.
Right.
But so in terms of like presupposing the order of nature, if you continue to test something and it continues to work, maybe there is an order. And like I guess there's the idea that you like haven't tested that final thing, right? And but like. Don't you think eventually you test, or eventually some human, like 500 years from now, will have tested enough to say, yes, like gravity works all the time? Like,
I don't think you need 500 humans. You can just take one of us, put him on the house, and push him over and see what it works. It works. That's not the point. The point is something else. The point is a logical problem. If induction doesn't work because it doesn't make any sense, you cannot expect just because the sun rose 5,000 times it will do so again. And, as Hume also points out, you need inductive reasoning in order to come up with inductive reasoning, which makes the argument circular. Well, then inductive reasoning doesn't work. So there is one philosopher of science who suggests that there is an answer to that. And that was Karl Popper, and I was hoping to get to that. But, well, let me see if I can jump ahead here.
Karl Popper, 2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, we have inductive reasoning. Okay, forget these old Germans. Right. We have enough of those in the room, so we don't need those guys. Equally strange. Okay, here is Hume's problem of induction. Now we have the Scotsman who doesn't work. Okay, here. So no logical reason to assume the future instances of which you have no experiences would conform to, the earlier experience. Okay, fine. That's one thing. The other thing is inductive reasoning. Arrive to the premise. You need inductive reasoning. Great. Circular. Doesn't work. Not very logical. Nevertheless, Vienna Circle, still, logical positivists build it entirely on an inductive reasoning. And then things become provable. Now we have the problem, no longer we can say, well, if it's inductive, I can actually prove things. The problem is, inductive reasoning doesn't work, so therefore, you can't prove anything in science to be certain. Logically, it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It's irrational.
all right, yeah,
Right?
it's a jump I'm not making.
Right,
but
exactly. Okay. So along comes this man. He's Austrian, so not German, so it's not my fault. And Karl Popper actually asked, okay, when should be a theory be ranked as scientific? Is there a criterion for scientific status of a theory? He wants to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. And in the cause, he argues that he solves the problem of induction. What he says is basically, okay, take the case of this guy here. Albert Einstein, really, I'm sorry. It's not that I'm German and I put all these guys up, right? Okay, so, what did Einstein say? There was the theory of relativity. This was in a time in the 1910s, and so for the first 10, 15 years of the 20th century. But a lot of theories flew around. Adler's psychology, Marxism, and so on and so forth. And what Popper says is this guy was different because he basically goes down a limb. He makes a prediction. And the prediction of his theory is actually that there will be gravitational lensing. If you have a big body of, I can't go into that now because, oh jeez, just take my word for it. It's in the map. So you have a big body here, like a star, and then that will bend light. Okay, now that's a great prediction that comes out of the theory, right? How is that different from Marxism? You could say, hey, look, light is bent all the time. Well, can you? That's really difficult to see. So you have to come up with a clever way of figuring out, is that really the case? The moment you come up with a clever way of figuring out whether that's really the case, you put the theory on the line. If the results show that's not the case, and if they had shown that, we would have never heard of Einstein.
Yeah.
Right? So what happened, Stanley Eddington goes to West Africa and observes the solar eclipse. And as you know, when you cover a light, you suddenly see things behind it, right? If you are out on the street, you cover the street light, you see the stars behind it, which before you couldn't see. Solar eclipse, same thing. So then you start seeing stars next to the sun that you otherwise could not see. You can measure the distances of these stars to each other and compare it to the distances between the same stars when the sun is not there, i.e. at nighttime, right? And then you see actually that there is, this is a little bit extended to show you, but there is actually a distance. And that distance pretty much lined up with the predictions of the theory. So what does our friend Kyle say to that? He says that if you look for confirmation one way or another, you will find it. That's no good. That's induction. That's useless. It's even useless for the scientist. Right? That doesn't get us anywhere. He says confirmation only counts as a result of risky predictions. You have to put a prediction on the line, he says. Every good theory, therefore, has to have prohibition. It has to say this and this is impossible. Right? Why? Because if it says that, then it becomes refutable, but if it's non-refutable, it's non-scientific.
Yeah.
He says every test of a theory is an attempt to falsify or refute it. So, your question, will we not eventually have tested it often enough to say, now we can rely on it, would just be, if you do induction over and over again, eventually you can do it. It's still induction, but now I buy it because I have not done it 5,000 times, but 6,000 times. And the logic would be still problematic, he says, as Hume says. So confirming evidence counts only when it is the result of an unsuccessful attempt to falsify the theory. So in other words, ad hoc alterations are problematic, right? If I find, okay, that didn't work, I say, no, it's still a good theory because here, look, that would be astrology, for example. So he says, if I say all swans that I've ever seen are white, therefore all swans are white, is a theory that I can falsify by seeing one black swan. The only thing in science, he argues, that I can be certain of is a falsified theory, that one is false.
Yeah.
Now that's logically very convincing, but we would have to go in the philosophy of science, which I wanted to but I can't get to, a little more to show that later philosophers have shown why that is problematic. All right, my take home for you really is science has metaphysical presuppositions, and they're not following from the science. They really have to be presupposed.
Thank you.
They're not